Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle from an entirely different location than the last time. I want to talk to you today about toxic masculinity, um, which is a potent topic, but I don't want to talk about it from a political perspective. I don't like talking about politics. It's a liability for a teacher and a fiction writer to really delve into that stuff. Not that it stopped most people, but that's my policy on that. Um, but to look at it from the perspective of the logic behind discussions of it and what implications that has for a fiction writer, because I think if you look at a topic like that, considering the Rainbow Circle, my friend the Rainbow Circle, uh, that reveals a lot of kind of the problem with uh, a lot of our arguments about uh, toxic masculinity, as an example. And this really came up as I was watching. I watched reviews of like Fight Club and things like that. And I just happened to watch, a bunch of reviews in a row of Fight Club for whatever reason, semi-randomly. I watched one by Maggie Mae Fish, and I watched one by Folding Ideas, and I watched one by Better Than Food. And I was enjoying Better Than Food's book reviews. He reviewed the book, the other two reviewed the movie. I was enjoying Better Than Food's book reviews. And we share a lot of taste, and that's the nature of critics. Most criticism, ultimately, reviews of things, ultimately don't matter really for whether or not you're actually going to enjoy something, unless you find somebody whose taste you agree with, and then the recommendations make sense. And that has implications for one of the big problems with the workshop system, which I was talking about in the last video, taking random people who have different tastes. So, but if Better Than Food, Clifford Lee Sargent, I think is his name, based on the fact that so much of our taste is similar, Lautréamont and Bataille and people like that, if he gave me a critique, I would take it more seriously, just because we have similar sort of taste in things. Then he reviewed Fight Club, and just as a sort of throwaway line, he said something about toxic masculinity, and then he said, as if anything about masculinity could be toxic. And, I was verging on, actually, well, he has a contest where if you donate more than $5, you get the book he's reviewing, and he reviews such great books. I strongly contemplated, would it really hurt if I just donated $5 to him? And he gives coffee too. It's a great contest. But then when I heard that, I said, can I really justify giving him $5 now? It was just a throwaway line. But it really highlights, just in that phrase, I've been thinking about that phrase, the whole idea of, can anything about masculinity be toxic, I think is what he said. Well, of course it can be. But a lot of the times when we debate concepts like that, we frame it in absolutist terms. I talked about this a couple of videos ago, in either or dualistic absolutist terms. So, of course, toxic masculinity exists. So, for example, tomorrow I'm going to a walk for survivors of domestic violence. I personally am a survivor of domestic violence, but I'm fully aware that male survivors of domestic violence are like 1 to 5%. I don't have the statistics on me right now. Very, very small percentage. Something like 5%. 95% is men abusing women. If there was no such thing as toxic masculinity, that percentage would be 50-50, presumably. But a lot of the times when we start debates about that kind of things, that kind of thing, on the one side, we would say toxic masculinity is a problem because it forces men into this perspective that they need to dominate women, and that leads to violence and what have you. And then the other side will hear that and say, well, I'm not violent towards women, therefore you're wrong in your claim that men are violent, therefore there's no such thing as toxic masculinity, which is an either-or absolutist sort of perspective. So just from, my experience, I could say I'm a male survivor of domestic violence. And I could say, this is not what I'm arguing at all, but I could hypothetically, if I had this dualistic either-or sort of perspective, I could say I am proof that it's not a problem with masculinity. That's not an accurate assessment of my particular situation. But that is that either-or absolutist sort of interpretation. But that's not the accurate picture at all. If it's 95% or whatever the percentage is, clearly there's something toxic that is overly represented within men. But that's not the same thing as saying all men are toxic by the nature of being men. But we tend to have that sort of dualistic perspective. But from the perspective of a fiction writer, that's partly problematic, having that really absolutist dualistic perspective. It's partly problematic because in writing a story, if we're really endowing a character with humanity, we need to be able to recognize the paradoxes of the character, to eliminate the dualistic absolutist perspective. And here's a parallel example of where that dualistic either-or absolutism comes into play, just as a hypothetical. If you look at like the anti-vaxxer movement, for example, and that's a well-documented example of where people have these perspectives that are not really based on evidence. So you have parents who are facing, the possibility of their kids being on the autism spectrum, and there's so much that we just don't understand about that, and there are ways, healthy ways to deal with that. But because it's a scary thing for parents and they don't understand it, they hear an entirely refuted explanation that vaccines lead to autism, no evidence behind that whatsoever. And they take the position that their kids aren't going to have vaccines. It's an irrational position, but it's born from comfort. And that's the thing to remember about the rainbow circle. The outer rim that's more dualistic and categorical and absolutist, the outer rim of the rainbow circle, is fueled by comfort. But it's a comfort that's so desperate that it leads to anger. Being angry at the other side of a particular argument is comforting because you're right and you're supporting your own team. It's a team perspective. You're supporting your own team. You're passionately advocating for your own team. And so the anti-vaxxers would desperately cling to this perspective despite clear, obvious evidence to the contrary. And the parallel there is the whole idea that men are victims. There's weird sounds going on out here. I kind of like the weird sounds. There's no evidence, if you made the claim men are the actual victims because women call them toxic, well, there's no evidence for that can really support it. But what's really happening is a defensive sort of desperate clinging to a comfortable place in power. But that really happens on both sides. If you look at the anti-vaxxer example, those who support science, they have all the science behind them, and they say there's no evidence whatsoever that vaccines cause autism. There's an adamant entrenchment of rightness in that perspective that and the criticism of, the belittlement and criticism of those who believe wrongly and against science, that ultimately leads to entrenchment of the two sides. Now, how that applies to storytelling, if you look at the rainbow circle, all of those perspectives are really on the outer rim of the rainbow circle, the comforting, dualistic, absolutist sort of end of the rainbow circle. If you look at the middle, the other end of the spectrum, it's visceral stimulation born from empathetic experience of another person's feelings. And the second level is the paradox of that experience. Those two really go hand in hand. So recognition of the paradoxical nature of human beings to such a degree that you feel the feelings of someone else. So let's say hypothetically I was writing a story about an anti-vaxxer. If I really adamantly held this perspective that anti-vaxxers were stupid, ultimately my anti-vaxxer character, would just be an object. It would not be a human being. He or she would not be a human being. He or she would just be an object. Just be an object of ridicule that I am using as proof that anti-vaxxers are not intelligent. But as a fiction writer, if I'm feeling an empathetic experience with that anti-vaxxer character, then I would recognize just the paradox of that position. I would recognize empathetically, why would an anti-vaxxer feel a certain way? Those are some crazy sounds. I like the randomness of the crazy sounds. Why would an anti-vaxxer feel a certain way? And and that's what I really started with. An anti-vaxxer is facing the complexities and mysteries of autism, and they hear a really simple explanation, an entirely wrong explanation, but a simple explanation that gives them something they can do that's relatively easy, very dangerous to take your child off of vaccines, but relatively easy choice to make. But they find comfort in actually doing something. But when you criticize them, they really entrench into that position. But if you recognize that paradox, that they're trying to protect their child by making a decision that's endangering their child, and that no matter how much evidence you give them, they entrench in that position, then you're more effectively able to create a character by having this empathetic recognition of the paradox of their position. This also relates to another thing I listened to on Invisibilia. They had an episode called "The End of Empathy," about the decrease in people's ability to feel empathy. And I think a lot of it, whether your position is right or wrong, I think a lot of it is tied with this entrenched dualistic absolutism of warring positions. But the example there had to do with an incel. Speaking of toxic masculinity, had to do with an incel. And one version of the story, it was a fascinating episode, but one version of the story strove to understand him, and another one was more critical of this incel, this anti-feminist incel. And so they posed the question, do you need to apply empathy to somebody like that, who has just a horrible philosophy about women and things like that? And the defense of not having empathy for him was that there's a limited amount of empathy, and that commonly in situations of sexual harassment and things like that, the men end up with more of the empathy, and that if you're defending a woman in a situation of sexual harassment, you only have enough empathy to spare for just one side. But that's a either or absolutist position. You're only able to feel empathy for one side. And if that's your political position, that's fine. But as a storyteller, if you're creating a character who is the recipient of sexual harassment, or somebody who's doing it, the dualistic absolutist position is going to strip either one of those characters of humanity. And that's where Fight Club comes in. I was going to get around to Fight Club eventually. Because Fight Club is I only saw the movie. I was tempted to read. I was tempted to become a Chuck Palahniuk fan. And I just dodged the bullet. Is that the right word? I just lost interest. I really enjoyed Fight Club when it first came out. And it's, in many ways, it's a beautiful movie. But then I just kind of turned on it and lost interest in it. And I just never got around to becoming a Chuck Palahniuk fan. But all of these interpretations, Maggie Mae Fish and Folding Ideas, it was very much a political interpretation, which would be quite different from coming at it from a writer's perspective. And Maggie Mae Fish and Folding Ideas both made the claim that and it's one of the claims I hate the most in the world. Drives me crazy. That everything is political, even the choice not to be political is political, which is an argument in bad faith, and it's a logical fallacy, and it's highly problematic to assign all art forms a necessity to be political. However, they are political critics. So a more valid way to describe it is to say, my purpose is to analyze the political underpinnings of this particular artistic piece. And that's 100% valid. Go at it. I mean, Maggie Mae Fish's analysis of Fight Club is a really interesting, compelling analysis. She doesn't need to be absolutist about everything absolutely having to be political, but it is a fascinating analysis. And she analyzes it as being an example of toxic masculinity. That's a big theme of that one. But from a writer's perspective, even though I turned on Fight Club and, don't enjoy it anymore, from a writer's perspective, I would recognize what's really compelling about Tyler Durden and the narrator. Spoiler alert on that one. If you don't know the twist yet, same character. But is that he does present both perspectives of the appeal of this hypermasculine point of view and the disgust of the revulsion. So Tyler Durden is simultaneously an appealing character and a repulsive character. And just me personally, it's not a successful story for me anymore. It was at one point when I was 20. Of course, as a 20-year-old, how could Fight Club be anything but appealing? But just as I grew older, not to say superior, that's not what I'm saying at all. It's just, it's sort of like when I read Catcher in the Rye. I read it at the wrong age, and I didn't find it appealing. Fight Club, I watched it at the right age, but then I just kind of grew out of it and didn't find it interesting anymore. But empathetically getting into the minds of those who do really love Fight Club, I think the success of it comes from recognizing the appeal of this very toxic character. And I don't think Chuck Palahniuk or David Fincher or whoever is really pulling the punches and showing that he's a very toxic character. Literally, figuratively, very, very toxic character. And recognizing the humanity of the narrator, showing what would be appealing about him, but also showing what is truly repulsive about him at the same time. So that empathetic recognition of the paradox of the character is arguably what makes Tyler Durden an appealing character. That's my 2 cents. But I would say the successful political pieces at the core, if you do have a political piece, and arguably Fight Club, I say not all pieces need to be political, but Fight Club is, political. a successful political piece doesn't take an entrenched, singular, dualistic, either or absolutist position, which has the potential to strip the piece of humanity. A successful piece, whether it's political or not, takes that empathetic position of recognition of the essential paradoxical humanity of the human characters, and that is what gives them life. They're not an object called a victim. They're not an object called a perpetrator. They're human beings with multiplicity of conflicting perspectives and feelings. Some of them sympathetic, some of them not, but ultimately living subjects, living human beings. That's my that's my 2 cents. Anyway, have a good day. I'll see you on the next episode, and maybe a different location with even weirder sounds. Who knows?